it shows that the default mode network, this part of our brain which has this kind of ego-like function, it constrains the kind of experience we can ordinarily have. It kind of puts some shackles on the communication between different brain regions. And when we take off those shackles, suddenly your brain is communicating in all manner of new, diverse and kind of novel associative ways, which we think gives rise to experiences like synesthesia and probably also creative problem-solving insights, and maybe even access to repressed and hidden memories, which are very useful in treating all kind of mental health conditions, for instance.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today we have the challenging job of getting our head around the psychology of altered states of consciousness, or exceptional human experiences as our guest today calls them. Are they mere illusions of the mind? Does their ability to radically change our worldview and sense of meaning in the world give them some special status in psychology? And how do we talk scientifically about significant similarities between such experiences across different eras and cultures that appear to imply the existence of some kind of alternative reality, whatever reality is? Unfortunately, to navigate this massive bag of worms, we have a researcher who's devoted his entire career to the study of these experiences, both psychedelic and other, the infamous Dr. David Luke. Dr. Luke is currently a module leader of the Psychology of Exceptional Human Experience at Greenwich University's Psychology and Counselling department, a course that he's been running since 2009. He's also currently an Honorary Senior Lecturer at the Centre of Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London. He's also a prolific author and editor of books, and today we'll be discussing his 2017 book, Other Worlds, Psychedelics and the Exceptional Human Experience, and his new book, a collection of essays that he's edited called DMT Dialogues, Encounters with the Spirit Molecule. He is also importantly the co-founder of the Breaking Convention Conference in Psychedelics. So I have been dying to speak, particularly about mystical experience, to a professional in this area for many, many years. So without further ado, let's go. Dr. David Luke, thank you so much for coming on the show. Welcome. How are you?
Thanks, Freddie. I'm great. Really pleased to be here and talking with you again.
Well, I really, really appreciate you coming on the show for a devoted show. We did speak to David as part of the specialist panel on psychedelics and reciprocity and medicalization. If you want to go back and check that at the Medicine Festival, that's in the first series, guys. So, David, I am always particularly curious to ask my guests if they remember their first conscious thoughts as an adolescent, as they so often have a particular significance. What were the first big questions you found yourself asking when you were a youth? And did they influence at all your future career?
That's a good question. I think I've always been interested in these kind of extraordinary limits of consciousness and the nature of the universe. I remember baffling my elder brother by asking him to explain, what was at the edge of the universe? How can the universe have an edge? Because surely there's just got to be more stuff beyond that. That was probably about age 5. And I don't know if I had any specific questions, but I had always had an interest in altered states since, spinning around till I went dizzy or just dabbling with my own neurobiology, like a chemistry playset. So I was always intrigued by the kinds of limits of experience and the kind of the nature of consciousness, I think. And it was kind of clear that was always going to be my trajectory.
So before we get into this trajectory and your extensive research, I want to sort of set the scene for the listeners a little by asking about the science of subjective experiences, because many hard scientists, the physical scientists, consider subjective experience as basically inadmissible data, even when it's collated across large test groups, because it's qualitative and rather than quantitative. I imagine you disagree. Can you tell us about how qualitative research works, some of the potential problems of reporting qualitative experiences, how you avoid those problems, and how you eventually draw conclusions?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would kind of turn that on its side, really, because I think there's a problem with the hard sciences if they don't pay attention to subjective experience, because we learned a lot through psychology about understanding biases and perceptual cognitive deficits and all kinds of things, which we don't necessarily experience the world out there as it really is. We have our own internal hallucination about the external world, if we can use these terms, internal and external. So subjective experience, in the sense of William James, who took this radical epistemological approach, is actually kind of vital to our whole scientific endeavor. So, empiricism, the study, which is the basis of all science, means to study the world, our environment, and understand it through our senses. But all of our senses pass through our consciousness. We have to sense something, we have to acknowledge it in our subjective experience. And that's what William James called radical epistemology, radical empiricism, sorry. It is a radical epistemology as well. But radical empiricism, it means that we have to include our inner subjective experience, because all of our sense experience is passed through our consciousness. So everything we know about the external world, everything that physicists rely on, for instance, and biologists and chemists and so on, it's all come through our experience. And so our subjective experience is essentially vital. And some of the ways we approach that in psychology is that actually you're right, for a long time, consciousness, since the time of William James, for about 100 years, was actually a very dirty word in the academy. You couldn't even utter its name without losing your job until about 20 years ago, really. And now the study of consciousness is a hot button topic, primarily through neuroscience, because the study of neuroscience is completely useless, really, without exploring how it relates. It's not completely useless without exploring how it relates to conscious experience. If you're mapping somebody's brain, it's just like high-tech phrenology. Those kind of old heads you used to get with the little kind of patches drawn on them. And this is where your thinking happens, and this is where your memory happens. Without kind of relating those to the inner experience of what's happening subjectively for somebody, neuroscience is kind of baseless. So the subjective experience is actually vital, not just in our understanding of consciousness and psychology and neuroscience, but also how that then spreads out into, how we perceive the world, what our beliefs are, and how they shape our understanding of the world, and how, the sociology of science drives the kind of science that is produced.
And how would a study of that kind of work? Just give us a little example of how qualitative research kind of gets around some of the problems that might be leveled by other hard scientists, neuroscientists, and actually comes to credible conclusions.
Well, the thing with qualitative data is it doesn't necessarily explore your classic induction, deduction, hypothesis testing system in a scientific way per se, but it does attempt to explore deeper meaning and relationships in people's experience of the world. But nevertheless, we can still get to the subjective experience by looking at non-qualitative measures. Like we have a whole battery of psychometric questionnaires which are designed to give quantitative data to impugn the kind of subjective experience that somebody's having. So we use like various measures in psychedelic research and cognitive neuroscience to explore the mystical experience or altered states of consciousness or experiences of awe or experiences of connectedness and so on. And they give us some kind of measure of those particular constructs.
And is there I'm presuming there's no way you can double blind that kind of experiment, as you say, because we're just relying on the consciousness of that person to report their experience. You can't really get around the embellishment of the individual there, can you?
To some extent, but it's a kind of numbers game, really. When you're trying to quantify subjective experience, The idea is that you have just a big enough sample, and that all the kind of noise in your data is reduced by the sheer numbers that you can detect any kind of genuine signal. So it's kind of signal to noise ratio kind of approach.
What is the right size of study in sort of the general literature? What's considered a statistically significant size study?
Well, that's quite a complex question, really, and that really depends on the size of the effect that you're looking for. So it's all to do with kind of power analyses in statistical research. All science is based on statistics and probability, and to ensure that you have a genuinely improbable result, which can't be accounted for by freak occurrences or error in the data, you need to have a large enough sample to detect that particular effect in its size. So it becomes some kind of somewhat tautological mathematics involved in, the size of your sample depends on how big the effect is underlying the process you're attempting to identify. So in neuroscience, they often use, maybe 20, 30, 40 people because they're looking at differences between brains or different parts of brain activity. And sometimes, and often, in fact, this is leveled at all science with human participants, including medicine. They're often underpowered, a lot of research, because it's very costly to employ enough people to take part in your experiments. And it's something that all kind of human science has been slammed for often being underpowered, of not necessarily having enough people. So it's a bit of a how long's a piece of string kind of question, really.
Well, David, I really appreciate you giving us that little grounding background before we get into some of the most exciting and out there research in all of psychology. I just think it's important that we get a sense of how we're grounding that in analysis. So like you, I have just always been fascinated by altered states of consciousness, or exceptional human experiences, as you're calling them. And before we get into your new book about conversations on DMT entity encounters, I really hope we could talk about your 2017 book, Other Worlds, Psychedelics and Exceptional Human Experiences. Now, although your work tends to focus on psychedelics, a lot of exceptional human experiences aren't induced only by psychedelic compounds, and you do include them in your book too. Can you briefly describe a few of the experiences that you put under this heading with psychedelic experiences, and tell us why they shouldn't be thrown out as anomalies?
Well, actually, I think anomalies are actually key to understanding the nature of reality.
They must be accounted for. It's not going to be a theory of everything if it's not accounted for. This is something that I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, science completely progresses by the anomalies. We have our particular theories and rules, and they work within certain parameters and limits. But the anomalies show us what's wrong with our theories, and how they fall down. So we should always be paying attention to anomalies. So they should never be thrown out. They need to be studied, very genuinely to try and understand why they're anomalous, right? But there has been a tendency within science and psychology and medicine and psychiatry to disregard what I call exceptional experiences and experiences in altered states, and just kind of put them under this kind of wastebasket label of hallucination, because it's kind of far easier to just kind of like discredit them a little bit and just put them all under the heading of hallucination, and then we don't really have to worry too much about them because they are essentially delusional. I think the science has advanced quite a bit since then in the last few decades, and now we are genuinely taking some of these experiences seriously and trying to unpack them and identify them and label them and see what the processes are. And that includes things like, on the soft end of the scale, just ordinary everyday anomalies like synesthesia, where have a blending of the senses, and through a whole range of other
just for the listeners who may not have heard of synesthesia, what is it? It's such a cool phenomenon.
So it's an experience whereby you have a blending of two sense modalities, so that you may taste shapes or see sounds or smell colors or something like that. And a small percentage of the population, about 2 to 4%, have this as an everyday reality. They have it as a congenital experience from birth. However, it can be induced in various altered states as well, particularly with psychedelics. So that's one kind of phenomena which doesn't defy too much about what we understand about the nature of science and materialism and all the rest of it. But then we start to get some more interesting experiences. The further we delve and stare into this medicine bag, we see experiences like out-of-body experiences, near-death and near-death-like experiences, mystical experiences, encounters with other seemingly sentient, discarnate beings, psychic experiences, and so on and so forth.
Mm. And presumably, you've got after having studied it for so long, you've spoken about this eco-psycho-spiritual model that in order to incorporate the implications of all of those experiences for the experiencer in a psychological sense, we need to have a sort of broader, wider understanding of human psychology. Tell us a little bit about this eco-psycho-spiritual model that you're kind of hoping might be more applicable in the future.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we kind of get the full range of human experience in any kind of model of psychology or reality that we have. And, the problem with psychology and psychiatry and so on, these, up until recently and still now, is that it kind of only looks at the middle and one end of the spectrum of experience in any kind of sensible way. It considers all the normal everyday psychology and experience that goes on, yourself and I having a conversation, our personalities, our sense perception. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have, psychopathology, what happens when things go wrong. What we don't necessarily have is all these kind of other extraordinary experiences on the other end of the spectrum, which aren't necessarily psychopathological, which I call exceptional human experiences. And the full range of those human experiences has to include the full range of our sense field and reality in our experience, from our own individual psychology through nature, our interaction with the planet and other species, and onto these kind of more, theological realms, we might call it. And there's an interesting corollary here, in that in the current research realm of the psychedelic renaissance that we're in, if you were to summarize the findings of this research so far, is that we find that psychedelics and other altered states enhance connectedness on every level, from the biological through to the theological. So we've got the biological, psychological, sociological, ecological, cosmological, and theological increased connectedness through the use of these psychoactive substances or altered states. And I could unpack that more and give you examples, but
I think that's a good start for now before we start delving into these one by one. But just briefly on the neuroscience side of things, is there any brain imaging evidence from neuroscience that studying these experiences, is there any correlation between increased or decreased activity in certain areas of the brain when neuroscientists study these experiences?
Yeah, so psychedelics in particular is an interesting case because they've only really been put under the microscope, so to speak, actually in the brain imaging, in the last 10 years. Even though the neuroscience has developed massively in the last few decades because of the prohibition of psychedelics, this research has taken a long time to start to happen. And when that research did start, the findings initially were a massive surprise. In that, every neuroscientist worth their fantastic neuroimaging grants would have put money on the bet that there was going to be some increase in activity in the brain, particularly in their favorite brain region, probably, when people to have a psychedelic experience, because the psychedelic experience is so explosive and overwhelming and kind of quite mind-blowing. It's, more experience was thought to be related to kind of more brain activity. And so the shocking surprise was there was no increase in brain activity observable in the brains of people when they were under the influence of psilocybin, magic mushrooms. But there were actually decreases, particularly in this key region of the brain called the default mode network. And that's kind of loosely associated with our ego identity, if you like. Whenever we're kind of thinking about ourselves or thinking about the past or thinking about our future, the default mode network is very active. And so under the influence of psilocybin and other psychedelics, we found this kind of big decrease in this kind of ego hub control center. And then that had kind of other knock-on effects, it seems, in the brain. So that when we reduce the activity in the default mode network with psychedelics, we also find a massive increase in the amount of connectivity between different regions of the brain. So although there's no more increase in activity, there is this increase in connectivity. So parts of your brain which don't ordinarily communicate with each other are suddenly striking up these kind of fascinating conversations. And it shows that the default mode network, this part of our brain which has this kind of ego-like function, it constrains the kind of experience we can ordinarily have. It kind of puts some shackles on the communication between different brain regions. And when we take off those shackles, suddenly your brain is communicating in all manner of new, diverse, and kind of novel associative ways, which we think gives rise to experiences like synesthesia and probably also creative problem-solving insights, and maybe even access to repressed and hidden memories, which are very useful in treating all kind of mental health conditions, for instance.
And that's definitely coming back to William James's and several other people in the past idea of the brain as a filter of consciousness. This idea that maybe the quotidian experiences being the majority of our experiences is only because the filter is set in such a way. And when we open the floodgates, a whole bunch of other stuff, seemingly endless alternative sources of information starts to come in. Okay, so we're going to be covering most of these that David has just listed with the specialists in those fields: out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, experiences of non-separation, non-duality, flow, meditation. We're going to be looking into the neuroscience of all of that. So that's something to be looking forward to. But David, I want to go into a bit more detail about mystical experiences. And this is quite close to home for me. When I was in my 20s, I had a mystical experience that lasted about 10 days. And I later wrote an essay about it, trying to make sense of it and the information that I felt I was accessing, calling it extended perception. That was just the term that came to me at the time. And I seemed to be able to see in my mind's eye the flow of some kind of energy through all things, a kind of vital energy. Maps. I was particularly obsessed with maps. They appeared to come alive with this flow. And in some areas were flowing more than others, as if they were sort of energy rivers. And I felt totally at one with the universe, as if I understood the chaos mathematics of this creation, and that I felt that all the sounds and images and happenings were part of a massive synchronized happening that was totally interdependent. And this was an experience that I later identified when I was at university with the Buddha's dependent origination teaching. I even felt I was in touch with a creator of some sort, and that it wasn't omnipotent. It was imperfect being, although extremely advanced. It's a long story, but that's just to give you a little kind of taster. I mean, maybe I can write more about this if the listeners are interested at some point. So do get back to me, guys, if you want to hear about this. But let's just say I was worried for my mental health. I was in my early 20s. I was on my own trying to work all of this out. But I was especially confused because I hadn't been stimulated by any substances, although I had been experimenting during those years. But when I researched mystical experiences, looking for some sort of explanation, basically looking to find out if I was crazy or not, I found that these experiences of oneness with the universe and feeling part of a synchronized, non-separate unity were quite common. And on the contrary, of being signs of mental illness, they were moments of deep insight into the nature of reality that brought this really profound sense of meaning to the experiencer, and a sense of meaning that brought happiness and purpose and a lack of fear of death. Now, your research has investigated this experience in your subjects. For you, what is the importance of such a meaningful experience to the understanding of mind, to the understanding of mental health, and of consciousness?
Well, you tapped on a lot of important points there, in that these experiences are deeply profound, and that they can and often do, if they're resolved and worked through in the most appropriate way, lead to a sense of greater equanimity, of kind of sense of understanding a little bit more about the nature of reality, of long-lasting positive mood and affect, these experiences of awe and wonder and deep kind of love, even often, experiences of unity and so on. They're extremely beneficial for our mental health. And I also think that they have the tendency to point towards a kind of deeper reality as well. That they give us an inkling of the real capacity of the human mind, which isn't our everyday, ordinary sense, normal waking state experience. When we go into these altered states of consciousness and try to discover the limits of our experience, those limits are very hard to find because the possibility of human experience is vast, absolutely vast, and I don't even know that there are any limits. So I think these have a really valuable role to play in helping us understand a little bit about our own capacities and potentials, and generally in making us feel better. But also, they're also important for our, as academics, as neuroscientists, our understanding of the nature of consciousness as well, because they may throw up really important questions about the nature of consciousness and where it resides and what it's made of and what its limits are. Which I've been trying to explore for a few years.
And presumably in the psychedelic research that is now being massively invested in, particularly at Johns Hopkins and at Imperial College, but in universities all over the world now, presumably there is a question here, because so many people have mystical experiences whilst on psychedelics, and so many of the people who are volunteering for this treatment, are not coming from the psychedelic community in any way. Presumably, it is quite an important question in the pharmacalization, in the medicalization of these compounds, as to the ethical implications of, are we looking to induce these experiences, or would we take the normal pharmacological model of removing any psychoactive element, as has been done with CBD treatment, with the cannabis treatments, in order to just have a clean drug that doesn't influence people's state of mind? Where's the scientific community on this one? Are they starting to say, listen, maybe we need to include this? Or are the majority of the medical establishment saying, listen, it's unethical to give these compounds to people, especially if they're suffering from depression, because it can create these extremely intense experiences?
Well, that's an interesting question. And we may be on the cusp of really kind of exploring that, because currently, as it stands, all the psychedelic clinical trials and treatment for depression, anxiety, addictions, post-traumatic stress disorder, end of life, existential fear, they've shown extraordinarily successful results, much better than any other comparative treatment, particularly for treatment-resistant conditions. And what they found is that in those studies which have explored it, when people have a mystical experience, they're more likely to have better clinical outcomes. Okay, if the psilocybin treatment induces a profound encounter with the divine, they're more likely to stop being depressed and quit smoking and drinking or whatever it is.
And sorry, David, to interrupt, where did you get that data? Which study is that coming from? And was it done by people who were vested in that outcome, or was that a surprise to the researchers who found that result?
Well, of course, this is going back to the importance of subjective experience and biases and other beliefs, because, of course, probably those researchers were invested in the idea of the mystical experience, but the science speaks for itself. If you measure the mystical experience using mystical experience measures, the findings show that the more of the mystical experience you have, the more likely you are to have better clinical outcomes. Of course, there's been about 6 or 7 clinical trials, research studies which have done that, and they all find kind of pretty strong correlations with clinical outcomes, particularly with the treatment of addictions and also end-of-life existential fear and depression, but also with just every communal garden depression as well. But not all researchers are using those measures. They're particularly being used more so in the States. Johns Hopkins team, for instance, are using these measures. And we can see a bit of a rift occurring. I think the data does speak for itself, that the mystical experience seemingly is part of the outcome, right? It is a mediating, moderating factor in the clinical efficacy of psychedelics. So there's currently, we're going to get to the point where we'll find out how important it is, because there are now pharmaceutical companies which are developing analogues of psychedelics with supposedly no subjective experience, but will hopefully do a similar job in their kind of treatment of mental health conditions. So the first one has just been published. It's an analog of iboga, which is an African root bark psychedelic, which is shown to have. This was only in rodents, however, which is shown to have a kind of in this kind of animal model. I think it was for addictions they found, or even anxiety. I'm not sure what they were looking at, but they found that it seemed to have like the kind of effects we were looking for in rodents, although this is all obviously quite artificial, without seemingly having any psychedelic effect. Now, we don't know if that's going to translate into humans at this point, because their clinical trial is only just underway, I think. These are new drugs. And so there's a race to trying to develop non-psychedelic psychedelics, if you like, so that people can have the benefits of this psychedelic drug without the psychedelic experience. Now, my bet is, and then everyone's kind of waiting to see how this pans out, my bet is that I think that the actual psychological component of the experience is going to be in some way valid and important. Now, we may find that we have some useful effects from these psychedelic drugs in lowering some of these indices of depression and anxiety or addiction. But my guess is they probably won't be as profound in their effects as those which, have the special ingredient X, i.e. the experience. And my feeling on that is, well, partly because I'm a psychologist, but partly because we see these massive correlations between reductions of symptoms in those people who have mystical experiences. And that mystical experience is kind of independent of the dosage. It's about the experience that ensues. And there's something important about that experience, I think, beyond the drug effects. The whole problem is here that we're seeing this kind of a bit of a rift and division between people who think that it's all down to the biology and the neurological stuff, which we don't really understand necessarily anyway, and that we can do away with the whole subjective experience. Well, time will tell. But
it might be a good sort of thought experiment to think for a second of, like, for example, dreams, where the majority of the time we don't remember them, but presumably they have a very strong experiential effect on the state of our subconscious, and we don't remember those. So it could be, I suppose, that there could be something happening at a subconscious level that is like an experience, because maybe dreams, we experience them, but then we don't remember them. But it's definitely controversial. I tend to fall on your side of that equation. It'd be interesting to see if the medical establishment can eventually put their hands up and say, okay, fair enough, we need to actually experience this to get the long-term effects. But that remains to be seen. Okay, David, moving on. The majority of your work has focused into the psychology of psychedelics, as opposed to these non-psychedelic stimulated exceptional experiences. And in these, we're seeing with psychedelics that similar experiences like sustained joy, a love of the beauty of the world, a sense of connectedness with nature and other people, and to some extent an insight into the limited nature of our usual day-to-day space and time experience. Tell us how you came to believe, it couldn't get much more controversial than this, that there was a connection between psychedelics and telepathy and precognition. I think it was via shamanism that you came to this idea, wasn't it?
Absolutely, but it's not particularly controversial, because if you look into the history of the research of psychedelics, pretty much all the first explorers, discoverers, inventors of psychedelics all had their own psychic experiences, usually on the kind of seminal voyage. Albert Hoffman on his first LSD trip, the man who discovered / invented LSD, had an out-of-body experience, thought he had died, somewhat similar to a near-death experience on his first LSD experience.
Grof reported similar things, didn't he?
Absolutely. Gordon Wassum, who kind of gave psilocybin mushrooms to the world from the Mazatec people, on his first encounter with a Mazatec shaman in a ceremony, the shaman, up a mountain, several days donkey ride from the nearest town, told him lots of things about his son back home that Gordon Wassum didn't even know, which turned out to be true. And then the shaman was under the influence of the magic mushrooms at the time. There's all of these, stories from all of the researchers. Ayahuasca, when it was first researched about 100 years ago for its chemical constituents by a Colombian chemist, was named telepathy, the alkaloids in ayahuasca, on account of the fact that the vast majority of the explorers and ethnobotanists who had encountered it had either witnessed experiences of a clairvoyant or telepathic nature or had them themselves. So these experiences are extremely common with psychedelics. People have these experiences naturally anyway with psychedelics, but they're kind of vastly increased through psychedelic experiences. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are real, because there's all manner of other explanations we could possibly put forward for explaining psychic experiences like telepathy and clairvoyance. Not least, it could be some kind of cognitive distortion or misremembering, but also it could be just coincidence. But there are, ways of approaching this research in a more controlled scientific way. And when we do so, the research from the last 140 years, it's 140 years next year of parapsychology, of scientific study of psychic experiences, has collectively shown that these experiences can be demonstrated reliably in laboratory research with enough experiments. Okay.
Can you tell us how, because you, over quite a few years and different tests, you developed a protocol whereby you could test this potential precognition thing. Tell us how, after quite a few years of trying different setups, how did it end up, the experiment, and what were your results?
Yeah, okay, I'll give you a little bit of an insight. I mean, I had a few trial and error at the beginning, and it ended up opting for this protocol, which is a little bit like the research we do with DREAM, ESP, and Ganzfeld, and so on. So the idea is that people in an altered state or not in an altered state, in a control condition, they just try and visualize a target. And in this case, the target is a future event, and it is a 1-minute video clip taken from a film. And the participant doesn't know what the target is. They just, with the intention of trying to see this future image, they just look into their mental imagery, and then they describe whatever it is they're witnessing. That's kind of recorded. And then they see 4 1-minute video clips, which are randomly selected. They are made, but they're kind of put into pools of 4 to be as different from each other as possible. Okay, one of which is the target. However, the participant themselves doesn't know what the target is, and nor does the experimenter, for that matter. In fact, nobody knows, because the target hasn't even been selected at this point. Okay, because it's coming from the future. And so they see these 4 1-minute video clips. They see how much they correspond to their own mental imagery, perhaps in a psychedelic state or not. And then they rate them and they rank them. And so we can say, okay, this one is the one that's most like their mental imagery. And then when that process is done, a random number generator, which is completely independent, it's based on, it just produces, almost perfectly random series of numbers that is used via a computer to select the target. And so that at some point in the future, the target is then identified. We can compare that to what the participant thought was the target out of these 4 clips. And we know with, absolute certainty that the probability of that should only be 25% chance of them getting it right. And what we actually see when we do this research, I've done this research in various kind of modes of states of consciousness, is that we tend to find higher than chance that they identify the target. So I've been looking at this with psychedelics in particular. I initially did the experiment with myself on mescaline and got about a 40% success rate. It was kind of highly successful. 40% doesn't sound like much, so it wasn't right all the time, which that would be absolutely staggering, but it was right more often than chance enough for it to be what we call statistically significant. I've since repeated the experiment with participants on LSD and also with DMT as well. And been getting some
similar results or slightly less?
Okay, so the interesting thing is that they're not consistent. They were significant, statistically significant in all of the experiments with mescaline, with LSD, and with DMT. In the case of the LSD, however, I was using top-level scientists as the participants, and they got a significant result, but in the opposite direction, which shouldn't happen either. So that they rated the actual target as the least like their mental imagery, but to a statistical degree, which means they are somehow, it would seem that the most simple explanation is that they're using precognition to try and thwart the experiment.
Right. And actually, listeners, this comes up in our first series interview with Garrett Medell, the quantum engineering physicist, who found exactly the same thing when he was doing remote viewing with his students in class. When they invited a famous skeptic in to observe the experiments, they found an exact negative opposite. So that they were actually getting side effects in the opposite direction. So that is really, really interesting, isn't it? And something that's relevant to what you were just talking about here, there we're looking for proof of some kind of precognition of which video clip the RNG was going to actually eventually choose. And what Garrett was telling us about here in the episode, it's about the experimenter effect, if you want to go back and listen to it. He mentioned that there was a similar anomaly happening with the double slit experiment and Wigner's collapse of the wave function kind of explanation, which has now become very, very famous, this collapse of the wave function idea to resolve Schrodinger's cat. So in the case of your experiment, Garrett's explanation might be that your intention to visualize the right answer interfered with the RNG's choice of clip. So we may be looking at as much at an observer effect interacting with the system as we are with a potential precognition effect. And he also referenced the skin conduction precognition experiments and saying that it showed this kind of basically half-second anticipation in the skin conductivity of random stimulus, in this case, a big horn that would come. And he suggests that we may have evolved some sort of slight precognitive response as part of our flight and flight response. Do you think that there could be a deep participatory universe explanation to these precognitive telepathic phenomena, to use the term of the physicist Archibald Wheeler?
Well, I think what model Garrett is kind of getting at is that there is the potential that there is some kind of collapse of the wave function, that it could be this perhaps even a psychokinetic effect. So we're actually affecting the random number generator, which of course would look like precognition. And in my experiments, I used true random number generators. So they were potentially susceptible to to being affected by our consciousness in a psychokinetic way, rather than it being a prediction of or receiving information from the future backwards in time.
Both side effects, though, interesting.
Yeah, I wasn't too picky about that. Now, the way you would get around that normally would be to use a non-true random number generator. You would use a pseudo RNG, like a prefabricated list of kind of responses or something like that. You usually get these kind of random number tables. That would be a pseudo RNG, if you like, which seemingly shouldn't be able to be affected by psychokinesis. I didn't bother with that because I wasn't too bothered whether or not it was precognition or psychokinesis. My paradigm was that it's precognition. But ultimately, a lot of this may fall down to the fact that it's the nature of time which is the problem here. And, according to our top-level physicists, time doesn't, as we experience it, doesn't really exist anyway. the current leading theory on the nature of time is the block universe theory, that everything from the beginning to the end of the universe just happened all as one big block of time. It's only somehow, and this is coming from physicists, right? This kind of subjective experience of there being this kind of continuous, ordinal, linear time is somehow illusionary, apparently. And yet, so that actually gives rise to, the possibility of precognition, and also accounts for perhaps why people, when they're having mystical experiences, can transcend time and space. They feel like a moment lasted several million years, for instance. So time is problematic. If you take time out of the equation, it's actually realized that it's neither psychokinesis and you're affecting this future event, nor is it coming back in time towards you. It's neither, and it's both. It's like we don't predict the future and we don't make it happen. They're just actually the same thing. I'll give you a little example of this. There was the two famous parapsychologists who were leading laser physicists before that, Targ and Puthoff, and they were working on the CIA Stargate psychic espionage program. And they'd opened up this kind of register of premonitions so that people could, send in their premonitions, and they would monitor them. And if they were right, they would contact them. There was this one chap who'd written in. He says, "There's going to be a lightning storm over this particular part of California at this date and time, and it's going to, knock out some power cables and all the rest of it." And sure enough, it happened. And they were like, well done, sir. You've managed to accurately predict this future event. And he said, "Predict it?" And he said, "No, I made it happen." And he was then, that he would then went on to cause all manner of lightning storms on demand, seemingly, with thousands of sworn affidavits testifying to his performances. So who can say, what is prediction and what is actually made to happen? And I think time here is the problematic element, and our relationship to time and our perceived reality of time may not actually be the underlying structure of the universe.
And of course, it was Einstein who brought our attention to this most profoundly. There's some really amazing Einstein quotes out there of his discussing the illusory nature of time and space. And we are definitely going to be covering that on the show, listeners. So do look out for the Time and Space and Not Linear show. I want to come back to shamanism, David. As you mentioned, there is a long tradition of shaman in every part of the world using altered states to travel, for want of a better word, to what they describe as a sort of spirit world. And then they contact some kind of spirit ally, usually some kind of animal totem of some kind. And they find the spirit body of the patient they're trying to cure. And then the spirit ally either removes the offending toxicity or tells the shaman what the subject needs to do to heal whatever their disturbance is, which is interestingly often psychospiritual, so referring to their life and their lifestyle, rather than to any medical changes that need to take place. Now, Dave, with such a long tradition, including just so many cultures that had no contact between each other and yet reported exactly the same features, exactly the same entities, have scientists studying this dared to consider that this particular other world to which they return daily and they get to know their way around, as it were, have they dared to consider that it has some actual reality? And if we were to dare, how would we conceptualize such a realm? Or is it just better to talk about the mind?
Well, this is a super interesting question, Freddie. I mean, so the people who have actually been studying shamans and their experiences and practices are usually anthropologists. And anthropologists don't really ask those kinds of scientific questions. They should be just kind of impartially reporting on their participant pool, right, of shamans and so on. So they don't ask these kind of empirical kind of questions in a scientific way. How can we demonstrate whether or not these experiences across all these different disparate tribes and communities across the world have this kind of overlapping correlation, and is that pointing to some kind of reality of this other world? Now, anthropologists generally have a bit of science envy. There are scientists of a kind, but they defer to the hard sciences, and wherein materialism is the dominant paradigm, and therefore, the spirit realm can't have any genuine reality or existence. And so they tend to just assume, or at least pay lip service to the idea that these are just experiences, right? So nobody's really explored this question from a scientific perspective. I would say it's never been taken into the lab. We've never kind of studied the different experiences of shamans and see how closely they relate in any empirical sense like that. But I think it's a really important question that should be explored. And one of the ways we can do this might be through the study of psychedelic experiences and looking at how well those experiences do relate, and how common are the encounters with these kind of other worldly beings. I'd say that question hasn't really even been addressed from a scientific perspective. It's just assumed that is A, too complex, or B, just impossible, or C, kind of, if it is kind of considered any kind of open-minded way, it's a bit of a threat to this materialist construct we have about the world.
I mean, the only reason that I sort of considered that it might be possible at all was because of what you're talking about qualitative research, and that presumably we could numerically assign features that we know from reports that all of these shamans, from the Inuit to Mongolia to Africa, they're all reporting very, very, very similar things. There could be a numeric style analysis of a large quantity of multicultural shamanic reports that could actually prove quite quickly, I think, serious similarities in those reports of that other world.
Yeah, I think there are a great deal of similarities.
Can you think of a few off the top of your head from all of the discussions you've had with shaman?
Well, I mean, again, I would put in some caveats as well. Like people like Jeremy Narby have eloquently pointed to, particularly in our last book on DMT Dialogues, that there is a gulf of language here. In that, in speaking to people from different cultures in their own language, there is a translation issue. So for instance, in the Achwa. There wasn't the Ashaninka tribe that he was been working with for decades. They don't really have a translation for the word spirit, but often when they're talking about these beings, Westerners infer that they're talking about spirits, but spirits is a very Western concept. The closest translations they have for what they're talking about are invisible beings, which become visible in certain states of consciousness, which are also them, that they are also part of these beings. They are members of their tribe. They don't refer to them as spirits, okay? So and you're going to have the same kind of problem when you're looking at all kinds of different cultures. So that particular bit of research is also problematic. But I think there would be some core features which would come through, that there is this sense of communicating with some kind of other, the transcendence of normal space and time, and that what you do in this realm through communication and negotiation with these other beings, which we might call spirits or we might call invisible tribe members, has an effect on this material world outside of this altered state of consciousness. And so, these communications, these dialogues, these negotiations often have a relevance and importance, and actually are kind of the fundamental substrate of this reality, of this normal waking reality. And that is kind of the essence of shamanism, I would say.
And there's an important point to note here, which we mentioned earlier, that shaman are using all kinds of hypnotic methods to enter into this state of mind. It's by no means solely with psychedelics and plant medicines. Percussion instruments, shakers, breathing, chanting, and dancing, they're all used. Is that significant for the brain science, for the way we might think about what's happening as they move into these altered states?
Yes, very much so. And I think that the study of altered states is certainly getting a bit of a revival. You know, it was a hot button topic in the 1970s. And now with the study of psychedelics, it being so kind of interesting now, suddenly, people are also looking back to altered states again. However, you know, the study of psychedelics has advanced the science, and we're yet to kind of apply that science to the study of altered states. And that's one of my ongoing projects. So I'm using the same kind of measures and approaches we're using with psychedelic science to look at altered states induced through dark rooms, anechoic chambers, flotation tanks, holotropic breath work, Kundalini experiences, all this virtual reality, whatever it might be. And all of these techniques are of course, all just techniques of getting into altered states. Classically, you know, shamans will use dancing, drumming, diet, dreaming, and what we call drugs, what they call plant allies or medicine or spirit teachers or whatever it might be. But, you know, these different techniques are all valuable in getting us into an altered state of consciousness, which has some commonalities across all altered states. So like going back to the brain imaging research with psilocybin and this reduction of the default mode network activity, we also find the same effect when you look at people in states of meditation, in states of deep hypnosis, and even in one Brazilian study with very experienced psychographers. These are trance mediums who do this kind of automatic writing. We see the same signature brain state as we see with psilocybin. And when we look at these psychometric measures of, you know, what kind of altered state people are going into, my research is showing that there is also a great degree of commonality across all altered states in the kind of type of experiences that come out of that. They often differ in the magnitude, however. So, you know, 2 hours in a flotation tank might get you further than, you know, a couple of hours in a Ganzfeld, for instance, right?
And the reason I think it's important is just because the scientific community as a whole tend to struggle more with hallucinogenic substances as a source of information about an experience, perhaps more than they might just from somebody who was in a state of meditation or who was in a dream state. I want to move on to one of the most wonderful words which was applied to Stan Grof in the old days, the psychonauts, literally the sailors of the spirit or the soul. Now, some psychonauts using, well, for example, high dosages of LSD, they believe that they are returning back and forth to other dimensions of some sort of other world, and meeting other entities that reside in those other worlds. They're going back and they're meeting the same people over and over again, same entities, quite similar to the reports of the shaman. What do you make of these attempts to map, for want of a better word, these inner dimensions of the soul? Is it valid research or is it just courting psychosis?
Well, I happen to think if it's done in a kind of safe and controlled way, it's valuable research. And in fact, you know, the underpinnings of all the entire psychedelic research renaissance is like the iceberg, you know, the tip of the iceberg floating on the 90% of the ice below the surface, which is psychonautic research. So people doing their, you know, people who've under the radar been studying the effects of psychedelics on themselves. So psychonautics has probably got us to where we are with our current understanding and the potential medical benefit of psychedelics currently. So I think it's valuable. And also, I think this endeavor of attempting to map these otherworldly terrains, these psychedelic experiences, particularly in terms of the kinds of beings that people encounter with things like DMT, for instance. And in fact, this has been one of my own research projects as well. It's now starting to emerge. People are doing systematic studies of DMT experiences and looking for the commonalities in the kinds of entity encounters they may have. For instance, you know, encounters with the little people are relatively common. Terence McKenna said, you know, everybody gets elves on DMT. Well, not quite everybody. Maybe 15 to 20% of people will have an elf encounter in the DMT realm at some point. So that they are relatively common, and that begs, you know, a deeper kind of questioning and interpretation. How do we account for those kinds of experiences? There are even more bizarre experiences like that. Often people find that the experiences are somewhat alien, but there are very specific encounter experiences, like encounters with giant praying mantises, which appear to be completely emotionless and are doing strange brain operations on people and farming them for their emotions. Now, that's a very specific type of encounter, which you may be surprised to hear is relatively common. So that kind of begs a deeper question as well. Now, the problematic thing again here, like the way in which culture and language is difficult in making parallels across different tribes, for instance, and their experiences, we can't ever remove the cultural influence from somebody's experience. So is it that people are having encounters with 25-foot praying mantises who are doing kind of bizarre brain operations and farming them for emotions? Is that because they've come across that particular meme? It's out there in the culture and in the literature. Or is it that this is a genuine core experience that comes from smoking large doses of DMT? And this is an interesting kind of perennial question. And so we have to carry it back into the cultural history of these experiences and the literature that's available. Now, I know people who are seemingly very naive to the literature have had these experiences often on their first DMT encounter, and they then become absolutely astonished when they find out other people have also had these experiences. And it's like, that makes it even more weird and terrifying in a way. But to have a watertight understanding and explanation of this, we have to somehow get beyond the possibility of cultural influences. Our experience of the world is always shaped by our own cultural influences, and we can never really know what an individual's cultural influences are. One of the ways we try to look at this is by looking at the very first DMT reports, which were actually kind of made by Stephen Zara in the 1950s. He was the first person to identify the psychoactive properties of DMT. He was a psychiatrist and chemist, and he injected him and his friends and his colleagues, his other psychiatrists, with DMT. Now, he didn't systematically record those experiences, unfortunately, but generally, yes, people had encounters with little people like dwarves, elves, whatever they might be, and also encounters with deities. So one of the first ever DMT trip reports from the 1950s from this psychiatrist, before anybody had ever tried DMT, was that sitting before me are two quiet, sunlit gods. It's very beautiful and very poetic.
I mean, obviously, listeners, we'll back up a sec here, because what we're talking about here is the book that David has just edited. It just came out in October of 2021, called the DMT Dialogues, Encounters with the Spirit Molecule, which is
the first book of DMT Dialogues. The book that's just come out now is the kind of sequel to that. It's called DMT Entity Encounters.
Oh, yes. Thank you for correcting that. And all of this will be in the show notes, so you can come and check out both of these books. It's a curated selection of essays from specialists in the field. But just give us a little bit of an introduction here for listeners who may be new to DMT. Tell us roughly, what is it? How and when does it occur in the brain and in nature? And what were the main themes that were thrown up in this most recent book that you think are important to push this research forward?
So yeah, DMT of all psychedelics is probably one of the most fascinating, because it's so widely occurring naturally in the plant world. It's considered that it might actually be present in all plants. It's found in many animals as well, including all mammals, including humans. So it's naturally occurring in our own body. When you actually take it, if you were to smoke it, you would have a kind of profound, often life-changing 10-minute experience. You light it, you inhale it. By the time you exhale, you've lost contact with this world and you're in some completely other world. Often, in the majority of experiences, involving encounters with seemingly sentient, discarnate beings, which most people perceive to be more real than, well, chatting to you, Freddie, for instance, which is a very real experience in my estimation. But so much so that of people who have had encounters with these beings on DMT, if they were atheists before the experience, less than half of them remain atheist after the experience, according to one research survey recently. So these are extremely profound, worldview, life-changing, metaphysically reorientating experiences, which can, annihilate atheism within the space of 10 minutes in the majority of people who have these experiences. That is not nothing. And, this chemical is also naturally occurring in the human body. We don't know exactly where it's produced. Various theories abound. Rick Strassman was famous for popularizing DMT through his research, and his theory was that it was created in the pineal gland, and it may also occur spontaneously in these kind of extraordinary experiences, like spontaneous mystical experiences or near-death experiences, or that it could be part of a process of a natural transition into a state of death, that your brain produces it at the point that you die.
I've also heard that it's present in the baby, in the minds of in the brains of newborn babies, and that it slowly reduces in quantity until they're sort of 6 or 7 years old. Is that true?
I don't know about that, actually. I haven't seen the research on neonate DMT levels.
I kind of thought, when I saw babies kind of staring completely absorbedly off into the distance, kind of, burbling and gabbling, I kind of thought, well, yeah, that could be the case, actually.
There's some similarities in the DMT experience to being a neonate, that's for sure. I don't know of the research on endogenous DMT, naturally occurring brain DMT in babies. There was some research which looked at DMT in the umbilical cord to see if there was a theory that mothers have a massive burst of DMT during labor. And Edie Fresca looked in the umbilical cord. He didn't find DMT, but he did find the enzyme precursor, which is required to convert serotonin into DMT in the body in high quantities in the umbilical cord, which was perhaps suggestive of the idea that there may be large quantities of DMT produced during the birth experience.
It also struck me as possible in young people, because anybody who has children out there will know the extraordinary reality of their imagined worlds and the imagined beings in their play is so extremely real for them. I can't help but imagine there may be the presence of some sort of psychoactive substance in their brain chemistry that allows them to believe so completely that these beings are part of their everyday life.
And this is the general theory that we basically walking around with our own psychedelic factory in our body, possibly in our brain, and that it acts like a kind of reality thermostat, so that you can, as you shift into these other realms, maybe having like your spontaneous mystical experience. I'm assuming it's some kind of spontaneity could have been induced by your own natural production of DMT. So. That's why it's possibly one of the most fascinating molecules in the universe to study as human beings, because it is so deeply profound. It's such a simple molecule, and it occurs within us. It could hold the key to understanding many, many things. And the name it's got as well, DMT, the spirit molecule, really points to this beautiful juxtaposition and paradox between a molecule, which is a very material, chemical substance, and the spirit, so it's this kind of like the fusion of this. It kind of sums up this uneasy paradox between our material existence and our spiritual experience that we can have.
And tell us about the book. How did you gather these amazing thinkers, and what kind of themes were being thrown up in this second edition, the DMT Entity Dialogues, that we need to pay attention to as this research moves forward?
Well, how I gathered these extraordinary thinkers and minds from across the planet was quite easy, because Anton Bilton, who's involved in the project and sponsored it, invited everybody to his extremely lavish, stately home for a kind of 4-day seminar. And so we're very grateful to Anton for doing that, and he's involved in the book as well. So we were able to kind of invite and lure and gather the greatest minds on the planet, we thought, who had anything to say about this particular topic on the nature of DMT entities and DMT experiences. And, these were people across the whole range of the academy, everything from cognitive neuroscientists and psychopharmacologists, ethnobotanists, cultural historians, anthropologists, you name it. We had the full range. And so we have this kind of great diversity of perspectives and opinions about the nature of these experiences. And I think that's completely vital, because I don't think any one particular standpoint holds all the answers. And it really has to be this kind of interdisciplinary approach to give us the full realm of perspectives and experiences. My own particular favorite comes from the anthropologist Luis Eduardo Luna, who's spent, he's kind of Amazonian himself. He spent decades exploring all these different indigenous tribes and their use of ayahuasca as an anthropologist and as a theologian. And he finds these commonalities in the indigenous perspectives around these things, and that is generally that there is no separation in the indigenous worldview between ourselves and these other beings, between ourselves and these, theranthropic hybrid human-animal kind of shamanic power beings, right? That they are us. They are our ancestors. We were them. They are us. And it's a completely different worldview. Right? It's not got this kind of divorced, demythologized, demystified, supposedly objective Western mindset of, anything that isn't in this kind of everyday perception is somehow worthless and delusional. It's very much, they have what the anthropologist Charles Laughlin called a polyphasic culture. The polyphasic cultures are those that employ and value a whole range of different states for what they can positively give us. Whereas in the West, we come from a monophasic culture, that we only really value the ordinary, everyday waking state of consciousness, perhaps kind of slightly caffeine infused just to make us more productive workers, and maybe a bit pissed on a Friday night just so people can relax a little bit. But, essentially we are really very kind of rigid and terrified of altered states, whereas lots of indigenous cultures, pretty much all indigenous cultures around the world, very much embrace this polyphasic view of reality, where dreams are just as important as a kind of a barometer of reality as is waking consciousness.
And one particular Indigenous spokesman, I can't quite remember the name of the organization. This came up in my interview in the first series with David Lorimer about the assumptions of Western science. He was talking about, I think his name is Leroy Littlebear, about the fact that Indigenous science tends to see the world as relational rather than relative. We're halfway there with our understanding of time and space, as we discussed earlier, but they're still thinking of it as molecules being relative to each other instead of relational, whereby everything is alive in some state or some sense or not. And of course, we're seeing the West slowly catch up with this through the rise of panpsychism, but that's all to be established here on the show. Give us some more detailed examples, because I know that you're keen to take this DMT entity research further. First of all, tell us some of the key similarities that we're seeing across all of history and across all of the world. What kind of entities are people continuing to see, and why? What are the implications of the fact that we're seeing such an extraordinary repeatability of this apparently insanely hallucinogenic experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're yet to really firmly establish how repeatable it is. I think there is definitely commonalities, and they're starting to emerge in this more systematic study of the phenomenology of the DMT encounter experience. So that is beginning to slowly emerge, and of course, the little people is one. Praying mantises is bringing up the rear somewhere, but often these encounters are with they're mostly usually very benign, if not neutral. Often, described in kind of angelic terms sometimes. They're often considered to be hyper intelligent, perhaps even omniscient, sometimes even kind of deity-like beings. And they're usually considered to be helpers or guides or healing or teaching. And these are the kind of roles that they generally take on. So there are some, emergent themes and commonalities which do not appear to be just completely random. Right? There's some sense of a landscape emerging, which we can begin to explore and taxonomize. But I think we've still got a long way to go in this research. My own particular endeavor in this direction, apart from just trying to map these experiences, is to try and get to the underlying nature of these experiences and see if they are, in some sense, real. And that's not any easy task to do. But one of the ways we've been trying to look at that is to look at shared experiences on DMT. So one of the things that people commonly report from ayahuasca, which ceremonies which contains DMT, is that they often have experiences where they felt like somebody else they were in the ceremony they were sharing their experience with them, like they were fully conversing with each other, having like this kind of telepathic, like shared experience. So we took this into our research domain, and we had people take DMT at the same time. Now they would come into the experience. Sometimes they knew each other from before. Sometimes they were complete strangers, and they weren't really allowed to communicate with each other before the experience. They would have this intense 10-minute experience where they're not communicating at all. And then they would separate them immediately afterwards and take them off and interview them and get them to draw sketches about their experience. And part of their intention was, in their experience, that they should attempt to try and share their DMT space with each other. Now, consciously, they often reported they weren't able to do that because, if you know anything about the intensity of DMT, it's very hard to kind of maintain any kind of thought or intention as you kind of get blasted off into this hyperspace. So often they reported that they didn't think they'd completely forgotten about the other person in their experience. But when we looked at their experiences and their drawings, we found some, astonishing correspondences. Now, we haven't yet put that under the analytical microscope, but we're yet to do that. We need to set up a paradigm whereby we have lots and lots of independent judges who don't know anything about the context of these experiences, and we're going to show them lots of people's experiences and drawings, and they have to try and match it with another one. They're going to say, okay, we show them two alternatives as well. We say, which one is this most like? Is this? And then so we've got a whole pool of people who took DMT together and their individual experiences, and people who took DMT on their own. And if we can find that there are genuinely statistically deviant correspondences between people who took DMT together as opposed to people who took DMT singularly, I think we've got a basis for further research. It would seem to, at least, I wouldn't say it's going to be hard evidence, but that I think it will point to the fact that this may well be worth exploring in further detail in more controlled circumstances.
Well, at least if it's a shared experience, you've got the witness that you need to make it a reality, in inverted commas. Is there anything else that came up in the book that you think is relevant to our conversation today? Any themes that got thrown up in those essays and conversations?
Only that there's some really extraordinary minds in there. And people like Jeff Kripal, who don't necessarily fall down in any camp, but just kind of urges to kind of take this agnostic stance, right? And consider this as, it's not just an imagination, right? It's that we're in what we might call the imaginal realm, right?
Yeah.
With these experiences, which is not just fantasy. But it isn't solid reality either, like as we know it in our ordinary waking state of consciousness. And it's something beyond and in between both of those. And this is where the deep fascination and the mystery lies. What is the nature of the imaginal? And I think, I'd urge people to read this book with an open mind and try and come at it as agnostically as possible, because I think when we jump to any kind of conclusions or attempt to form any hard beliefs about these things, we're always going to come unstuck. And I think it behooves us to remain truly open and agnostic in our approach to these really fundamental questions about the nature of reality.
Yes, and Sue Blackmore, the well-known skeptic who's been studying consciousness for a long time, in episode 1, when we talk about this, she said the don't know mind is very, very important for studying consciousness. And I think Kripal's onto something there, isn't it? It's just really, as soon as you start becoming attached to concepts, which are really just representations, a bit like a painting, but in words, you're bound to fail, because that concept will is only as valid as the moment at which you're attaching it to whatever it is you're trying to describe. So I quite agree there. Now, you mentioned the psychedelic renaissance, which is in full flow and now, interestingly, courting investment from big capital and inclusion from big pharma. So it's a very exciting time and a bit of a confusing time. I do recommend going back to the panel at Medicine Festival, which we recorded with David and some fascinating thinkers, both on the Indigenous side and on the more medical and psychiatry side. So do go back to that. It's a very complex and interesting time for this. But David, I wanted to ask about this new fashion of Westerners seeking out these DMT experiences. I think the most popular at the moment are ayahuasca ceremonies, but iboga and peyote and psilocybin, large amounts of Westerners are being drawn to these shamanic ceremonies, almost as they were drawn to the psychedelic raves of the 1990s. Dave, I'm sure you were there with me at some point. We probably shared a dance floor at some point. There was a strange draw to that. And I see a similar fashion now with these ayahuasca ceremonies. Where do you stand on this? Do you think it disrespects in some way this long tradition of shaman who've used ayahuasca in traditional rites of passage and healing ceremonies? Or do you think, in a way, this slightly consumeristic style of showing interest in the West serves as an important publicity opportunity to bring attention to this really, really important psychological tool?
Yeah, all of the above, basically. It's neither one nor the other. And I think, there's some important caveats in all of it. I think it has, potentially massive benefits for the whole species and the planet. Not just the indigenous people or Westerners going out on ayahuasca tourism, but it's not without its problems of cultural appropriation and disrespect and all kinds of stuff going on. But I think the indigenous shamans, certainly the ones I've encountered, it's an imperative for them, and not just a financial one. I mean, I think that probably pays into it. These people have been impoverished and downtrodden and abused and colonized for 500 years or more, and so of course they have a right to earn their money however they want to. And I think by sharing their plant medicines with the rest of the world, that's completely their choice. But also I think they have an imperative in that. From what I gather, a lot of them are saying, it's not time for us to kind of keep our last secrets hidden. It's not time to hang on to whatever bits of culture hasn't been appropriated and colonized by the West, because we think there's a genuine possibility that if we share our plant medicines with foreigners, they'll stop sending over their companies to destroy the planet for its natural resources and suck up huge quantities of the Amazon and blow up vast tracts of the desert and destroy all their peyote and all the rest of it. So I think a lot of the indigenous shamans have a real genuine urge to share and in a hope that the Western world will collectively begin to wake up some more if they have access to these plant medicines. And at the same time, I think the Western use of these medicines can often be a bit frivolous and a bit self-serving and often misses the point and commercializes these really sacred approaches to alterations of consciousness.
And also uses them as mind-altering substances rather than medicine. My fear is really that we see it as just yet another in our sort of portfolio of caffeine, alcohol, cigarettes, whatever other things, uppers and downers, that we use for various things. This sort of consumerization of something so deep and spiritual. But it sounds that you more or less you think that the positives outweigh the negatives.
Yeah, I think the positive massively outweigh the negatives. There are certainly negatives, and we need to pay attention to those and try and ameliorate those as best we can through, like paying attention to reciprocity, for instance, and sustainability and so on and so forth. I think that's all really vital. And at the same time, the use of these substances may even give us better insights into those kinds of issues. Particularly my research and some others recently has been looking at the propensity for psychedelics and plant medicines to make people more ecologically orientated. We see massive shifts, in fact, in people's nature relatedness and ecological orientation through the use of psychedelics, even if they just take them in the laboratory. And of course, this has massive importance in our current climate and our current literal climate. I mean, we've got the conference going on at Glasgow currently. We're in a state of ecological catastrophe, in crisis. We're in the biggest wave of mass extinction on the planet in millions of years, and it's man-made. What are we doing about that, And people who take psychedelics tend to increase their sense of concern and connection to nature through their use of these plants and medicines. So I think there's some important payoffs, not just for individuals, but on a kind of planetary level in the use of these substances. Just to go back to your other point, though, as well, yes, these things have been used in a sacred way by indigenous shamans throughout the world. But if you look at how they were used and what purposes they were used for, you wouldn't really see that appearing on your ayahuasca retreat brochure, right? So, according to anthropologists who studied these things before they became really popular decades ago, most of the purposes that ayahuasqueros would use ayahuasca mestizos, it was for people coming to them for love magic, for instance, right? That was one of the most commonest uses. It's like basically sorcery, how to make people fall in love with you, or to remove the effects of sorcery and bad luck. It's not like they're just kind of somehow beyond human, pious, spiritual beings who don't utilize these substances for making, for dealing with daily psychological concerns. They absolutely did. And they'd use them for hunting, they'd use them for warfare, how to kind of find your enemies and in the jungle and go and attack them. So it was not always for like, we've got to also be careful of projecting our Western viewpoints onto these indigenous people as well. They are human. They're like us, and they may have very different concerns and completely different worldviews, of which we can really benefit from learning about and studying. But they also have their very human concerns as well. Shamanism is a very imminent approach to spirituality. It's not this kind of transcendent, we're up in the clouds or wearing white and going beyond our physical needs. It's very much it's a very practical approach to spirituality, and it's about healing and all of those kind of things. But it's also about, making things happen in the real world as well, be that through hunting or making people fall in love with you.
Well, David, thank you so much for this brief insight into exceptional human experience. And it's been very, very interesting to put alongside each other the psychedelic version of that with these non-psychedelic exceptional human experiences. And just to speak to a scientist who is able to consider these options without ruling them out. And I think this is a really, really important, as I mentioned, the don't know mind is really, really important in the practice of science, as well as making sure there's space in whatever models we're considering to consider that which has yet not been explained, these so-called anomalies, which you rightly said are probably the most important thing to be studying at the fringe of our scientific theories. So listeners, do go out, check out David's books, check out his Breaking Convention conference, where all of this is discussed on a regular basis. And look, there he goes. He's got the cup up there. Sorry, David, just have to say something so that we see that. You have to just say something as you show us your cup.
Yeah, this is we've even got our own mugs. I don't know if that's backwards. It's backwards in my view, but it should say Breaking Convention.
It was the right way around this end, which is great. So do check out that conference, and all of the things we've been discussing will be in the show notes, ladies and gentlemen. So do go and check that out. It rests only to say, on behalf of the listeners, thank you very, very much, David Luke, and wishing you all the very best in the future.
Thank you very much, Freddie. It's been great. Thank you.